cracked rib jutted from beneath a frozen breastplate. The snow around it had long since stopped being white. Nearby, the body of a young squire lay curled as if in sleep, mouth open in an eternal gasp, his eyes pecked clean by ravens. The stench of death had turned acidic, mingling with wood smoke and wet wool, drifting over the battlefield and seeping into the thatched homes of villagers who had no say in who wore the crown. The dead were not the only ones left behind. Survivors hobbled through the icy mud, some crawling toward the trees, others slumped against broken pikes. At Toten, the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, over 28,000 men were slaughtered, some trampled in blind retreat, others butchered as they begged for mercy. And when the killing ended, the sky offered no reprieve. It snowed harder. This was the opening chapter in a conflict that would span 3 generations. This was the Wars of the Roses. But before we step deeper into this forgotten corridor of history, if stories like this awaken something in you, a fascination with the darker truths, the untold legacies, the shadows that shaped empires, then I invite you to tap that like button and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden past. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you joining me from? I'm always amazed by how these long-buried tales are being rediscovered by curious minds across the globe, all of us connected by a hunger to understand the world, not just as it was told, but as it truly was. The roots of the Wars of the Roses grew in poison. Decades of weak kingship, economic hardship, and bitter family rivalries had left England fragile, like a stained glass window spidered with cracks. When the glass finally shattered, it wasn't a sudden event. It was the culmination of rot. At the heart of it were 2 branches of the same royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Both traced their descent from Edward III. Both believed they had the rightful claim, and both were willing to kill for it. Henry VI, a timid and pious king, wore the crown when the storm broke. He was not built for rulership. Prone to long periods of catatonic silence, possibly inherited from his French grandfather, Charles VI, Henry allowed power to pool in the hands of scheming nobles and his iron-willed queen, Margaret of Anjou. He preferred prayer to politics, contemplation to command. And in a kingdom churning with ambition and greed, that was a fatal flaw. The first spark came in 1455 at the First Battle of St. Albans. Yorkist forces, led by Richard, Duke of York, cut down several of Henry's key allies in a brutal street skirmish. A curious detail survives. Henry VI was reportedly found wounded and dazed near a local tanner's shop, calmly singing hymns as blood soaked through his robes. The battle was small but symbolic. The illusion of Lancaster invincibility was shattered, and Richard of York had tasted the intoxicating scent of momentum. It was a time when men named Lord Lovell and Sir Thomas Hungerford would switch allegiance not based on principle, but survival. Castles changed hands like tavern tokens. Betrayal became a language, and the battlefield replaced the courtroom. One obscure anecdote survives from this early period, perhaps apocryphal, but revealing. During a siege at Ludlow Castle, Yorkist forces abandoned their posts and fled after a rumor spread that the devil himself was fighting for Lancaster. Why? A particularly ugly warhorse, covered in soot and chained in black iron, had been spotted charging the gates. The animal belonged to a minor noble with a flair for drama, but in a superstitious age, such sights turned bowstrings slack. As battles flared, Blore Heath, Wakefield, Mortimer's Cross, the carnage accumulated. Heads were spiked on gates. Limbs were nailed to city walls. One chronicler noted that blood ran in the ditches like swine's offal. This wasn't just civil war, it was surgical dismemberment, one noble house at a time. And then came Toten in 1461. Imagine a field soaked in freezing rain, wind howling like a funeral dirge. The snow, whipped by gusts, blinded archers. Arrows thudded into flesh with sickening regularity. Men slipped on frozen entrails. Swords shattered against skulls already split. And when the tide finally turned against Lancaster, it became a rout. Drowning in the River Cock beckoned as the only escape for many, and that water turned red. One gruesome fact often omitted from textbooks. The survivors at Toten were ordered to strip the dead of usable clothing, not out of respect, but because England couldn't afford to waste fabric. Corpses were rolled naked into trenches, while peasants pried off boots stiff with congealed blood. Many took lice home as a souvenir. Edward IV, the dashing son of Richard of York, seized the throne after Toten. At just 19, he had outmaneuvered generals, seduced nobles, and bathed in enemy gore. He was tall, charismatic, and merciless, a king born of battle. But England, ever fickle, was not finished yet. Historians still argue whether Edward's reign was a restoration of order or merely a pause in the storm. What's certain is that the war had mutated. It was no longer about Lancaster versus York alone. It had become a war of vengeance, of betrayals stacked like bones in a crypt. The noble families had become hydras, cut off one head, and another snarled in its place. And behind each crest and banner, ancient grudges fermented. The next act would not be decided on snowy fields, but in candlelit halls, poison-rumored bedrooms, and towers that looked out over the Thames. The roses had been watered with blood, and they were beginning to bloom. The tower stood silent, its thick walls radiating damp. Moss clung to the stones like secrets. Below the surface, in a narrow chamber once used for storing cannon shot, 2 boys slept, or so the official records once suggested. No final breath recorded, no burial site named, no body ever found. They were Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, aged 9, sons of Edward IV, heirs of the House of York. And in the summer of 1483, they simply vanished. Before their disappearance, England had once again teetered on the edge of something darker. Edward IV's unexpected death left his crown to a child not yet old enough to command a horse, much less a kingdom. In theory, the late king's trusted brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was to act as Lord Protector until young Edward came of age. But trust, in these wars, was an expendable currency. Within weeks, Richard intercepted the boy king's entourage and escorted him, politely, ceremoniously, with banners and blessings, to the Tower of London. Officially, it was for his safety. Tradition dictated that monarchs prepare for their coronation within the fortress. Then Richard delayed the coronation. Then he declared the boys illegitimate. Then he took the throne, and the children were never seen again. History has rarely dealt so chilling a hand with such studied ambiguity. Chroniclers of the time, many writing under political duress, painted Richard III as either protector or predator. One version claims the princes were smothered in their sleep by 2 henchmen, James Tyrrell and John Dighton, on Richard's order. Another, less popular theory suggests they died of illness, quietly, inconveniently, and were simply hidden away to avoid scandal. A fringe theory, bordering on the grotesque, proposes that the boys' corpses were sealed behind a false wall and entombed with a priest to watch over them, trapped in death as they had been in life. In 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase in the tower found a box containing 2 small skeletons. The bones were reburied in Westminster Abbey, but never conclusively identified. Forensic attempts in the 20th century proved inconclusive. Scholars still argue, were they the princes? Were they murdered? And by whose hand? And yet, beyond the academic fog, there is the sharper image, the eerie candlelit hush of that tower room, the way dust might have settled over folded child cloaks and the half-played board games of doomed boys. Richard III ruled for just over 2 years. His reign was marked by a curious blend of reform and fear. He enacted laws to protect the poor from unjust land seizures, and he opened books of legal procedure to the public for the first time. But none of it could drown out the rumors. A withered left arm, a hunched back, a scuttling limp. His enemies painted him as the very shape of deformity, a physical manifestation of moral rot. Modern studies of Richard's skeleton, discovered beneath a Leicester car park in 2012, confirmed scoliosis, but not the twisted monster of Shakespeare's drama. Still, paranoia surrounded him like a second cloak. Richard took to sleeping in armor. One courtier recorded that the king would wake at night drenched in sweat, demanding fresh wine and whispering of shadows moving in the walls. The realm's moral compass had long since shattered. Nobles who had dined with Edward IV now plotted to overthrow his brother. Whispers of rebellion buzzed like flies at court. One prominent Yorkist lord, Thomas Grey, fled to Brittany, where a new player was gathering support. Henry Tudor, of distant Lancastrian blood and dubious claim, Henry was a political orphan raised in exile. He had spent years in France, moving from cloister to cloister, harbor to harbor, while Yorkist rule dominated England. But the deaths of the princes, real or rumored, created a vacuum, and into it Henry stepped. By 1483, he had sworn to marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV. A masterstroke. If successful, the move would unite the warring houses and make him king by conquest and marriage. But back in England, Richard clung to power with increasing desperation. He eliminated rivals with ruthless efficiency. One noblewoman was reportedly sewn into a canvas sack and tossed into the Thames. No trial, no burial, no record beyond a servant's haunted diary entry. A forgotten detail often overlooked in this period: the Tower kitchens. In 1484, the royal kitchens reportedly began employing dumb boys, mute servants, to reduce gossip and accidental eavesdropping. It didn't work. A cook named Anthony Clow fled to Calais with tales of strange noises behind sealed doors and the stench of lime drifting from the tower's eastern wing. The public mood turned sour. A solar eclipse in June of that year was interpreted as divine disapproval. Crops failed. Rumors claimed cows gave birth to twins, an omen, in medieval superstition, of dynastic instability. Richard's crown sat heavy on a head that could no longer rest. And across the Channel, Henry Tudor readied his fleet. The Wars of the Roses, which had begun with armies charging under snow-choked skies, were now being waged in whisper and shadow. The battlefield had become the nursery. The crown rested not on the brow of kings, but on the heads of children, lost and never found. The sound of hoofbeats was drowned by the roar of a mob. Mud clung to the hem of her gown. Iron clinked beneath silk. She rode not side saddle, but astride like a knight. Her armor glinted silver beneath the gray sky, framing her jaw like a prophecy. This was not how a queen was supposed to look. But then, Margaret of Anjou had never followed the script. She wasn't born of English soil. She was French, proudly, visibly, and inconveniently so. The wife of Henry VI, the mother of a prince, and for over a decade, the de facto ruler of a kingdom that had no appetite for another foreign queen, especially one with a taste for blood. To the Lancastrian loyalists, she was a lioness defending her cub. To Yorkists, she was a witch in armor, a seductress and butcher who held her weak-willed husband in a spider's grip. The truth, as ever, lived somewhere in the mire between myth and motive. By the 1460s, England had grown used to instability, but Margaret's campaigns brought something new: maternal vengeance sharpened into strategy. She didn't just fight, she hunted. When her husband, Henry VI, fell into one of his vacant trances, eyes open, mouth slack, oblivious to the crown slipping from his head, Margaret acted. She gathered forces in the north, drew loyalty from Scots and mercenaries, and marched on Yorkist strongholds. Her orders were simple: show no mercy. At the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, her forces captured the Duke of York, father of the future Edward IV. His head, adorned with a paper crown, was mounted on the gates of York as a warning. One chronicle claims Margaret sent the head south packed in salt and rosemary, a gruesome parody of a holiday gift. Whether true or not, the story stuck. She led troops into battle, a rarity for women of the time, but not without precedent. Joan of Arc had haunted the English a generation before. Margaret, however, didn't rely on mysticism or prophecy. She used alliances, treachery, and cold steel. There's a lesser-known account of one of her pre-battle speeches, recorded by a scribe hiding behind a barrel cart. "They will say I fight like a man. Let them. I was never taught to cower." This, from a woman who had to navigate court etiquette with one hand while drafting war orders with the other. A popular rumor of the period, scrawled in marginalia by a London monk, accused Margaret of conducting pagan rites in secret, naked rituals in the woods with her inner circle of ladies-in-waiting, mooning the stars and cursing her enemies with mandrake and foxglove. In truth, there's no evidence beyond the fevered misogyny of the time, but the accusation stuck. Even her shadow was enough to terrify. Historians still debate whether she and her close ally, Pierre de Brise, were lovers. Some say she ruled with her heart. Others argue she ruled in the absence of any functioning monarchy. But few contest this. She was the spine of Lancastrian resistance. Her son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, was raised on the battlefield, not in a nursery. He was reported to have asked after the death toll after his first engagement, and when told of a captured Yorkist noble, the boy is said to have replied, "Let him lose his head, as others have lost theirs." Whether that line was invented by his enemies is unclear. But the prince's upbringing, amid tents and death, rumors and blood-soaked maps, left its mark. His marriage to Neville, daughter of the mighty Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, was meant to cement alliances. Instead, it laid the foundation for betrayal. The Kingmaker had once backed the Yorkists. Then he turned. Then he turned again. His allegiance flipped so often that satirists of the time sketched him as a man with two faces stitched back to back. Margaret, desperate to reclaim the crown for her son, accepted his offer of support. Together, they launched an invasion from France. But the tide was already turning against them. At the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, the Lancastrian forces were crushed. The prince, Margaret's son, her legacy, the last true flame of Lancaster, was dragged from the field, bloodied and stunned. Eyewitness accounts vary, but one common detail remains. He was brought before Edward IV and his brothers. What happened next still sparks debate. One account claims he pleaded for mercy. Another says he remained silent. A third, offered by a Yorkist courtier, suggests the boy lunged forward and shouted, "I am the son of kings," at which point he was struck in the face and hacked to death on the spot. He was 17. Margaret was captured, her son dead. Her husband, once the king, found days later in the Tower of London, murdered in a locked room. His skull had been caved in, but the official story claimed he died of melancholy. The crown returned to Yorkist hands. The Queen of England was sent to prison. Yet even there, the myth of Margaret endured. A strange story emerged in her later years. During her captivity, she kept bees. Not for honey, but allegedly to train them. Prison guards reported swarms collecting at her window each spring. One swore he saw her whispering to a hive. Another claimed she sent coded messages through wax-sealed combs. These tales are almost certainly fictional, but the fact they were believed says everything. To many, Margaret had become a figure of terror, half-witch, half-warrior, mother of a slaughtered prince. To others, she was simply a woman who fought a world that never wanted her. Her legacy would be buried beneath Tudor propaganda and Shakespearean caricature. But for a brief, blood-slicked decade, she was the beating heart of the Lancastrian cause. And when she fell, a silence spread through the kingdom, not peaceful, but haunted. The silence of a war that would not die. The morning fog at Barnet clung low and thick, rolling over the battlefield like a suffocating shroud. Blades glinted only at the last second, emerging from the mist like fangs. Men screamed not from wounds, but from confusion, slashing friend and foe alike. Somewhere in that chaos, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man who once made and unmade kings, lay bleeding in the mud, his back broken, his name being spat from both Yorkist and Lancastrian mouths with equal fury. They called him the Kingmaker, but in the end, he died without crown or cause, trampled, looted, and left to rot. Neville had once been the most powerful man in England. He brokered marriages, commanded armies, and orchestrated successions like a conductor directing a symphony of swords. No single noble had amassed so much influence since the days of William the Conqueror. His alliances were slippery, shifting with the wind, but for a time, he controlled the rhythm of war itself. And then, he overreached. His first puppet was Edward IV, a dazzling warrior king and his cousin by blood. Together, they had toppled the Lancastrians. Warwick envisioned himself as the master behind the throne, the architect of a Yorkist golden age. But Edward had other plans. He married Elizabeth Woodville in secret, a Lancastrian widow, no less, and far beneath the aristocratic matches Warwick had prepared. She brought with her a vast, ambitious family. The Woodvilles moved quickly to seize offices, titles, and influence. Warwick, who had dreamed of being the real power in England, found himself shouldered out. And so, like a scorned lover, he turned. He allied first with George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's treacherous younger brother, and then, in an astonishing twist, with his old enemy, Margaret of Anjou. That's right. The Kingmaker who had built the Yorkist throne now joined with the widow of Henry VI, promising to restore her husband and crown her dead son. It was a move soaked in irony and desperation. In 1470, Warwick invaded England and briefly restored Henry VI to the throne. Though the king, passive and broken, was little more than a figurehead. One court observer compared him to a wax candle left in the sun, still upright but melted within. The triumph was short-lived. Edward IV returned from exile with an army, taking advantage of divisions among his enemies. He moved swiftly, striking with brutal efficiency. At Barnet in 1471, Warwick's forces were caught in fog, both literal and strategic. A deadly miscommunication sealed his fate. The Lancastrian army mistakenly attacked its own rear guard, mistaking banners in the mist. Panic rippled through the ranks. Warwick tried to rally his men, but was unhorsed and killed in the melee. Later accounts describe his body lying face down in the mud, stripped of armor and robbed of rings. One soldier claimed to have stolen his boots and worn them for a month, until the soles peeled off, reeking of battlefield decay. Warwick's death marked more than the fall of a man. It signaled the death of the old noble order. No longer would magnates like Neville rise on blood and marriage alone. The war had become more personal, more dynastic, and less feudal. It was no longer about influence, it was about survival. Meanwhile, Edward IV reasserted his dominance with lethal resolve. He hunted down traitors with icy calm. Clarence, his own brother, Warwick's former ally, was arrested for plotting yet again. The punishment was poetic and grotesque. The Duke of Clarence was reportedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Whether apocryphal or real, it became one of the most retold anecdotes of the war. Some say he chose the method himself. Others say it was chosen for him as mockery. The detail that is often omitted: Malmsey wine was incredibly sweet and thick. Imagine death not as suffocation, but as syrup slowly filling the lungs, while limbs thrashed against the wooden casks curve in utter darkness. By 1475, Edward IV ruled unchallenged. His court glimmered with gold and cruelty. Executions were held quietly now, often in the Tower or on remote estates. Enemies disappeared rather than died publicly. It was a time of velvet gloves hiding iron fists. Still, the Yorkist dream was unstable. Edward's health began to decline. Obesity, ulcers, and suspected liver failure plagued his later years. His appetite remained legendary. At one banquet, he reportedly ate 4 entire capons and a tray of sugared violets before vomiting in a side chamber and returning for more. He would drink red wine steeped in cinnamon to settle his stomach, only to collapse in bed for hours after. When he died suddenly in 1483, the succession again spiraled into chaos. He left behind 2 sons, young, vulnerable, and in the care of his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Yes, the same Richard who would later take the throne as Richard III. The same Richard whose hunchback silhouette has haunted English drama for centuries. But before that infamous usurpation, before the Tower swallowed the princes, the kingdom had already grown brittle. Edward IV had ruled with might, but not with foresight. His wars had paved a road of corpses, and on that road, the next generation would soon march. The kingmaker was gone. The princes were gone. Clarence drowned, Margaret caged, Warwick butchered. The battlefield now belonged to ghosts. And in the distance, a Tudor banner flapped in the wind, blood-red and newly stitched. The king's crown rolled across the battlefield like a discarded toy. Its gold was dulled by blood and grit, its velvet soaked through. Beside it, the body of Richard III lay twisted and exposed, his armor torn, his skull split. Stripped naked after the fight, he had been slung over a horse like a sack of meat, limbs dangling, face unrecognizable. The last king of the House of York had died in a ditch, roaring defiance to the very end. So fell the final rose of York. The Battle of Bosworth, fought on August 22, 1485, brought a brutal close to 30 years of dynastic war. It was not the largest battle of the Wars of the Roses, nor the most technically impressive, but it was the most decisive. It marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the rise of something new, something quietly engineered in the backwaters of France and Wales, the House of Tudor. Henry Tudor had little right to the throne by blood. His claim came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of the illegitimate Beaufort line. once barred from succession by royal decree. But in an England exhausted by war and ghosted by lost princes, legitimacy was increasingly a matter of perception. Henry's march through Wales had gathered a strange coalition: Lancastrian diehards, disaffected Yorkists, foreign mercenaries, and men simply tired of fighting. His banners bore the red dragon of Cadwallader, an ancient Welsh king, invoking both prophecy and nationalism. He was barely known in English courts, but to many that was a blessing. Richard III had governed through terror since the death, or disappearance, of his nephews. Despite some capable reforms in law and administration, his rule was tainted by paranoia. He traveled with a personal guard twice the size of his brothers. His lodgings were inspected thrice daily for poison. Food tasters were executed at the slightest suspicion. One survived by biting his own tongue and pretending to convulse. A clever trick, though it cost him his post. In the weeks leading to Bosworth, Richard made a critical error. He overestimated his control. Two powerful nobles, Lord Stanley and Sir William Stanley, rode to the battlefield without pledging support to either side. Richard, knowing the Stanley family's loyalty to Henry through marriage, took Lord Stanley's son hostage. He sent messages warning that if they did not fight for him, the boy would die. The Stanleys waited and watched. The field at Bosworth was uneven, muddy, and cramped. Richard held the high ground. Henry, unfamiliar with English warfare, let his seasoned captains guide the positioning. For a while, the clash unfolded like many others. Archers loosing volleys, cavalry circling, men screaming under the weight of morning fog and expectation. Then Richard saw his chance. Henry Tudor had placed himself toward the rear, protected but visible. Richard, in a moment of raw daring, decided to end the battle with a single charge. He led his household knights straight at the would-be usurper, carving through Henry's guard with terrifying precision. His lance shattered a Welsh captain's breastplate. His sword struck down a banner-bearer. He came within a blade's length of Henry himself. And then the Stanleys moved. Sir William Stanley's men, watching from a distance, charged down the slope directly into Richard's flank. The king's vanguard was overrun. Surrounded, Richard refused to flee. Multiple eyewitnesses claimed they heard him cry, "Treason! Treason!" before vanishing into a sea of steel. His helmet was knocked away. His skull was punctured in at least 8 places. One wound, driven up through the base of the skull, likely killed him. His body, stripped and battered, was later displayed in Leicester. His feet were tied together, and he was slung over a horse backwards, his nakedness intended as humiliation. A quirk of fate. The land where he died was marshy and unremarkable. Years later, farmers struggled to recall the exact spot. It would take archaeologists over 5 centuries to find his remains beneath a council car park. When the sun set that day, the age of the Plantagenets was over. Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield with a borrowed circlet. He reigned as Henry VII, beginning a dynasty that would rule for over a century. To secure the throne and end the dynastic bloodbath, he married Elizabeth of York, Edward Ivy's daughter and sister to the lost princes. It was a union of necessity and symbolism. Red rose and white, Lancaster and York. But peace, as always, was a fragile thing. Henry quickly moved to erase threats. Dozens of Yorkist claimants were imprisoned or exiled. Some were quietly executed. Others vanished behind the walls of monasteries or went abroad, a phrase that often meant something darker. His paranoia was quieter than Richard's, but no less intense. One lesser-known anecdote from early Tudor rule. Henry ordered all royal portraits be painted with ears slightly elongated. To better hear the people, he claimed. In reality, it was an internal signal to his spy network. A portrait with shorter ears marked a potential traitor. It was a painter's code of death. Scholars still debate whether Henry's rule truly ended the Wars of the Roses or merely masked its wounds. Pretenders like Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel would rise, claiming to be Yorkist heirs. Henry crushed them without mercy. But for the common people, who had lived through 6 decades of shifting monarchs, of sons turned soldiers and fields turned graveyards, Henry's cold order was a relief. The war had left behind a country hollowed by trauma. In some villages, an entire generation of men had vanished. Fields went untilled. Songs were rewritten to omit names that now carried death. A superstition lingered well into the 16th century, that to plant both red and white roses in a single garden would invite madness. The Tudor rose, a new emblem, merged both colors, but its roots were watered in blood. The echoes of this civil war still ripple through time, not as trumpet blasts, but as quiet tremors in stone. Churches rebuilt over mass graves. Family trees truncated by sudden, violent ends. A crown passed hand to hand like a relic no one truly owned. We often speak of history in terms of battles and dates, but the Wars of the Roses were something deeper. They were a war of cousins and courts, of whispered betrayals and sharpened ink, of mothers turning sons into soldiers and brothers into corpses. They were a slow rot eating through the marrow of England's noble houses, one generation at a time. Today, we know the symbols: the white rose of York, the red of Lancaster, the fusion of Tudor. But behind those symbols are faces. The child kings, the queen in armor, the madmen in power, the kings drowned, hacked, vanished, the commoners who survived by growing silent. And perhaps that's what remains most haunting. How easy it was to slip from loyalty to death, from banquet to betrayal, from nursery to noose. Now the tower stands as a tourist site. Bosworth is a field of grass. But listen carefully in these places, and you may still catch it. The hiss of a blade through fog, the scrape of armor over stone, the silence where two princes should have laughed. History rarely ends. It just buries itself, waiting to be unearthed by the curious.